Imagine this scenario. Two of the most powerful nations on the planet, the United States and China, engaged in an all-out war. On the surface, it sounds like a fictional disaster straight out of a dystopian movie. But with rising tensions, territorial disputes, and competition for global dominance, the possibility of conflict between these two superpowers is more real than ever. So, what would happen if war actually broke out between the US and China? Who wins and who loses? In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into the catastrophic impact such a war would have, not just on the two countries involved, but on the entire world. One of the most immediate and devastating consequences of a war between the US and China would be felt in the global economy. These two nations are the heart of the world's economy, with China as the factory of the world and the US as the largest consumer market. Together, they account for nearly 40% of the global GDP. So, imagine the impact if their economies were to collapse due to a full-scale war. The trade war that started in recent years between the US and China offers us a glimpse into what could happen. In the event of a direct conflict, international trade would come to a screeching halt. Supply chains, which are already vulnerable and stretched thin due to the global pandemic, would be further disrupted. Goods would no longer flow freely between these two nations, and entire industries would be thrown into disarray. China, a major supplier of goods to the world, would find its factories shut down or destroyed. The US, on the other hand, would face shortages of everything from electronics to clothing. The knock-on effects would be disastrous for global markets. Stock markets would crash, currencies would fluctuate wildly, and inflation would skyrocket. Countries that rely heavily on imports from the US or China, particularly in developing regions, would see their economies crumble. Millions of people in nations far from the conflict would lose their jobs as industries collapse. The global economy could face the worst recession in modern history, with no clear way out. While the economic consequences would be severe, the military impact would be equally catastrophic. Both the US and China have massive military forces, and a war between them could quickly escalate into a global crisis. It's important to understand that both nations possess vast arsenals of nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads that are capable of wiping out entire cities in an instant. The early stages of the conflict would likely involve naval battles in the South China Sea, airstrikes, and cyber warfare, but things could escalate quickly. With both nations on high alert, the possibility of a full-scale nuclear exchange could become very real. If such an event were to unfold, the consequences would be nothing short of apocalyptic. Cities on both sides would be decimated by conventional and nuclear bombings. The toll on civilian life would be staggering. Millions of people would die, and the human suffering would be unimaginable. Even countries far from the front line would feel the effects, with nuclear fallout spreading across borders, poisoning air and water sources, and causing widespread health problems for decades. The most tragic aspect of any war is the human cost, the loss of life, the destruction of families, and the suffering of innocent civilians who had no part in the decision to go to war. In a conflict between the US and China, the civilian population would be the primary victim. Imagine the horrors of large-scale airstrikes, missile attacks, and ground combat tearing through densely populated cities. It wouldn't just be the soldiers fighting in the battlefield who would suffer. It would be the everyday people caught in the crossfire. Mothers, children, the elderly. People simply going about their daily lives, now facing the devastation of war. Refugee crises would emerge as millions of people flee the destruction. Hospitals would be overwhelmed with casualties, and basic resources like food and clean water would become scarce. Even after the war ends, the scars would remain. Millions would be displaced, economies would take decades to recover, and entire generations would grow up in a world shaped by violence, loss, and trauma. While the US and China might be the primary combatants, a war between these two nations would have far-reaching implications for the rest of the world. Countries that have strong economic and political ties with either the US or China would find themselves caught in the middle. Take Taiwan, for instance. Taiwan is a critical point of tension between the US and China. If war breaks out, Taiwan would likely become a central battleground, with the US supporting Taiwan's defense and China aiming to assert its claim over the island. This could spark conflict in the broader Asia-Pacific region, with countries like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines being drawn into the war. Europe, already struggling with issues like Brexit, economic uncertainty, and rising political extremism, would find itself under immense pressure. European countries are heavily reliant on both the US and China for trade, and they would be forced to choose sides or face economic collapse. Similarly, countries in Africa and the Middle East that depend on China's infrastructure projects or the US foreign aid would suffer greatly. As the world's superpowers clash, global institutions like the United Nations, NATO, and the World Trade Organization would be stretched thin. The United Nations, in particular, would face an unprecedented crisis as it tries to mediate peace talks and provide humanitarian aid to war-torn nations. A war between the United States and China would be a disaster of unimaginable proportions, with consequences that go far beyond what we can fully comprehend. While it's impossible to predict the exact outcome, one thing is clear: no one truly wins in such a conflict. The people, innocent civilians caught in the crossfire, are the real losers. Both nations are global powerhouses with advanced military capabilities and immense economic influence. The devastating effects of a war between them would ripple across the entire planet, plunging the world into chaos. The economic fallout would be severe and all-encompassing. Both the US and China are economic powerhouses, and their interconnectedness fuels global trade. A war between them would paralyze global supply chains, disrupt markets, and send shockwaves through every nation dependent on their economies. Global industries would grind to a halt, trade agreements would collapse, and inflation would surge. Countries that rely on the US for consumer goods or China for manufacturing would find themselves facing shortages of essential products, while international markets would experience the kind of instability that could take years, if not decades, to recover from. But it's not just about economics. The human toll would be staggering. While military forces would bear the brunt of the fighting, it's the civilians, men, women, children, who would suffer the most. With modern warfare, cities would be targeted and populations would be decimated by bombings, cyber attacks, and, in the worst-case scenario, nuclear strikes. Entire regions could become uninhabitable, while millions of innocent lives would be lost or irreparably scarred. This isn't just a loss of life, it's a loss of potential. The untold future contributions of those people, the dreams never realized, the families torn apart forever. The future of the world depends on the choices we make today. We are all interconnected in this globalized world, and no nation can afford to isolate itself from the consequences of international conflicts. The fight for power, dominance, or territorial control may seem compelling in the short term, but it is the global community that suffers in the long run. If the US and China engage in all-out war, we all lose, regardless of the outcome. The alternative, a world torn apart by war, would leave us in ruins, struggling to rebuild in the ashes of our own mistakes. So let us continue to hope for peace, support diplomatic efforts, and encourage dialogue. Because at the end of the day, the future we build for ourselves, our children, and the generations to come will be shaped by the decisions we make now. The choice is in our hands, and the cost of war is far too high for anyone to bear. We must act, and we must act now, before it's too late. Because in a war between the US and China, no one wins and the entire world loses.